Now, why the allegory, the Gospels being originally allegorical, why that eclipsed mystery? Various scholars have proposed different theories. The null thesis is that we see this all the time. Actually, we look at the cargo cults, you look at the ancient mystery cults, you look at the Hadith. It's the natural progression to start historicizing and inventing history and inventing persons that did things and said things. Religions tend to do this. So it actually makes sense that they would. Another example that we have is Origen himself. This is a Christian scholar of the 3rd century. He actually let slip in a discourse once that he says that you have to control the masses and to control the illiterate, lower-ranking, pew-filling Christians. It requires feeding them literal stories and letting them believe that they're literally true, because they're not educated enough and not advanced enough to understand the allegorical meaning. And you need to save them, or otherwise they're going to die and then they'll end up in hell. So to save them, it's better to just let them believe the literal stories. And then if they move up enough and get enough education and can then you can let them in and say, okay, these things are just allegories. You got to understand them.
Hello, thanks for checking out this video. Topic of my video today is I've changed my view of Jesus based on further research. And what I mean by that is I am a secular person and I've always viewed Jesus as somebody that was a historical figure that was crucified, and then later on there was a religion that was built around him and evolved based on him. But I have a secular view of religion, and I'm not a believer in Christianity. But I always thought, because it was always explained to me, and when I was looking into this over a decade ago, it seemed like the consensus was that there definitely was a historical Jesus. And now I don't think that there ever was an actual Jesus. Like I think that I've gone down a rabbit hole, and I've been, updating my research, because the last time I really did like a deep dive into this was more than a decade ago. I think I was reading Reza Aslan at the time, who has, problems. So he was just one thing I was considering, but like it's been a while since I really had been deep diving into the historicity of Jesus. And Reza Aslan's thesis was that Jesus was most likely a zealot, which was a sect of Judaism which was very rebellious and aggressive, and that's why it was probably crucified. But I have been listening to lectures by Richard Carrier, who's a PhD and a historian, and then I watched some lectures with him and some other secular scholars about the historical Jesus, and it seems to me likely, like the odds are 2 out of 3 odds, like about 66% chance there was no historical Jesus, most likely. About 1 in 3 odds that there was, in my opinion. And there are about 10 competing mainstream theories that are in mainstream secular scholarly work with the historical Jesus. So there's like 10 competing models, and the one Richard Carrier's is a minority. It's not the but I think, based on the debates I watched and the fact that he has put out research relatively recently, that he has the best arguments that I'm aware of at this point. So I think that I'll link in the description a lecture by Richard Carrier, but I think that most likely all of this was something that's composed and created around a guy that never actually literally existed, for a bunch of reasons. And what's so interesting is, really I got into this topic for a bunch of reasons, but I love science fiction, I love reading, love books, and it was only recently that I really got into Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. And I got into that because I was watching a lot of predictive history lectures by Professor Jiang, who has an amazing channel. And I've just always been a really, really huge, just really into studying the history of humanity and civilization, right? And again, I got this movie from the library. You guys should watch Quest for Fire, because this is an amazing movie. Excuse me. And if you want to study civilization, you should start at the very beginning, because you will realize that economics, money, and religion, and these things, they don't evolve independently of each other. You kind of have to have a big picture view of human civilization to understand how these things come about. And religion is definitely a social control tool. And to understand Christianity, you really do have to understand Judaism, but you have to understand ancient Egyptian society and Hellenistic Greece. And the thing is, the original. I'm also from a rural area where I grew up. There were a small town with a lot of different types of Christians. There's also now cults like literal types of cults, and I'm really fascinated by cult psychology. And I know for sure, even with conspiracy theories, with things that aren't religious, like flat earthers and stuff, there is an aspect that of human psychology that people like to feel like they're an insider and have inside knowledge on something that the rest of the world doesn't know about, to make them feel special. And that is something I think that's very appealing about the mystery schools, which are like early Christian sects. I think were mystery schools before Paul kind of later changed it over to a different model for political reasons. But so what I was saying is, I learned more recently too that Judaism wasn't really monolithic at all. There were at least 30 to 60 competing sects of Judaism at the time of the supposed historical Jesus's life, and there are the Pharisees, and there are these various groups. Like I said, the Zealots is one, but I think that the savior cults too. That's the thing. What I think was going on was the Jews created their own. The Jews created their own religion that was just a version of a popular style of framework for religions at the time that they got through cultural diffusion of dying and rising savior gods, which are fundamentally really Greek. Other examples are Osiris, Adonis, Romulus, Inanna, the original one, which was about a woman, Zalmoxis. These are all personal savior gods motifs with a dying and rising god figure, and I think that this counterculture sect of Jews just kind of liked that idea and started using it. And then later on, the historical Paul, who did exist, created a lot of Christianity. I think it's highly unlikely most of the central figures in the Jesus story are ever existed. Like I don't think he exists. I don't think James, his brother, ever existed, or any of that stuff. Just from a historical probability perspective, and I think that's interesting. But like I said, I'm very fascinated by the way religions evolve, and Judaism, it really came out of Egypt, but it's literature, the Hebrew Bible, right? And the Exodus is not a historical event. It never happened. Moses never existed. Jesus never existed. It's unclear if Muhammad ever existed, but these earlier figures, they're literary creations, pardon me, and it's just interesting to see the way that the priest class throughout human civilization has understood human psychology very well, or have evolved to understand it well, and have been able to craft narratives that have this appeal. Christianity is just something that's it's well designed in various ways, especially the death and resurrection story, and it answers the fundamental questions of life that drive people. So simple people really like Christianity for the framework that it gives them for making sense of reality, right? And there's a lot to say about that, but the more intelligent people recognize this for what it is, and that's there's the sheep and the shepherds, right? And I find this interesting from the shepherd's point of view of how they design these religions. And I wanted to say, look at the Book of Mormon, for example. That's so obviously, the whole Mormon religion is something that you can invalidate, and you can prove that it's the product of a con man, and yet people are still extremely devoted to it because human beings have evolved to be religious. And Mormonism puts a white guy kind of at the top of their spiritual hierarchy and lets them have multiple wives. So the whole thing makes sense to me as like why those guys would create it. But to be a believer in this stuff is, as an adult, it seems just so odd to me. It's my own opinion. That's what I want to mention about that. So I'd like to hear from people that are also secular-minded people that are interested in this kind of stuff, what your opinion on Jesus was historically. Do you think he was an actual guy that at some point existed and was like a hillbilly preacher that wandered around doing faith healing and then eventually got crucified for some reason? Or was he like a religious zealot? Or is he a complete literary creation? What do you think? And what scholars, if you know of any, do you find most compelling in their view of Jesus? I'm going to link some stuff for Richard Carrier in the description, and probably something by Professor Jiang as well. So I hope you guys leave comments, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks.